my favorite panels of all, including the ones that I'm on, because I'm not on it, but I get to hear lots of really interesting things. This idea started 15 years ago when I wanted to hear how James Carey went about thinking about what he thought about. And I came up with a few other people that I wanted to know how they went through their process, and ran a panel, and it was just amazing. And I've done it a couple of times since then. This is going to be the most interesting of all, clearly. The scholars that we have, and I'll introduce them very briefly because otherwise it will take an hour and a half just to introduce them, are different in their approaches, in their backgrounds, in the spheres that they do their work in. But instead of talking about all that, I'll just give you the fun facts. So Ben Bates is associate professor of communication studies, and the Barbara Gerald Schoonover professor of health communication and associate director of graduate studies at the School of Communication Studies, Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University. That's not the fun fact. The fun facts are he's taught on at least 4 continents, and he's been named the outstanding faculty mentor in his school for 5 of the last 8 years. And the other thing that's a fun fact for us is that he's going to be planning the 2017 PCA convention.
So you'll have to come to Boston.
You have to come to Boston, you have to be on lots of panels and do lots of photos. Juliet D. Got her PhD from Temple, right here in Philadelphia. And she teaches courses in TV production, but also First Amendment. And in fact, has published on objectionable music lyrics, which leads me into Tom Gencarelli, who is the edge of ECA and the New York State Communication Association. I mean the edge as in guitar. You'll take that, won't you?
Sure.
He's an accomplished musician as well as an accomplished scholar. And he's at Manhattan College. Oh, I forgot to mention Juliet D. is associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Delaware. Tom Gencarelli is the associate professor and founding chair of Manhattan College's Next Generation Communication Program.
The next generation thing is theirs.
Well, they say it's yours on the website, so it must be true. Renee Hobbs is professor of communication studies and the founding director of the Harrington School of Communication and Media at the University of Rhode Island. And the best way I think of describing Renee is that she's a media literacy guru and evangelist. And is one of the key people in the intersection of libraries, media literacy, law, and numerous other areas. Media literacy taking over the universe, I think. Enough about that. And what I'd like to do is ask the panelists to answer some or all of a few questions that I posed about how they go about their process. What inspires their work? What kinds of sources do they use? Where do they get insights? How do they set up their academic files, paper or virtual? How do they structure their research? How do they communicate with colleagues within their own institutions, across different places in their institutions and places like this? And how do they go about the process of writing? So let me turn it over first to, we'll just do alphabetical order, so we'll start with Ben Bates. Thanks.
Thanks, Lois. And welcome all of you here. It's good to see that we actually have more than 5 people in the audience. It's a rarity at this conference, so give yourselves a round of applause for being active intellectuals. I'm always surprised when I hear the listing of my title come out, because I'm the Barbara Gerald Schoonover Professor of Health Communication. But if you'd asked me 15 years ago, would I be a health communication scholar, the answer would have been no. Health communication people do statistics and stuff like that, and I'm a rhetorician. Well, I'm still a rhetorician, but I operate in the world of health. And the reason that I do that is in part because of family lineage, but also in part because I am inspired by a statement by the Greek rhetorician Isocrates, who told us that we have to banish from our work all vain speculation that has no practical impact on the lives of man. He was writing that 2,500 years ago, so you can put man and women in there if you wish. I'm also inspired by Kenneth Burke's idea that we are obligated to use all that there is to use. And one of the things that I noticed when I was talking with colleagues who were interested in issues of health and well-being is that they didn't use all there was to use. They said, we're interested in statistical tests of different message designs or measuring how many talk turns are done by patients and how many by physicians in a clinical encounter. I said, there's more to it than that. What is the inherent symbolization that's going on here? What ideological structures get activated? All kinds of things that you could use. The other thing that I noticed was that many of my rhetorical colleagues were engaged in the idle and vain speculation on issues that have very little practical impact on our lives. And I said, you're great at analyzing ideological formations and finding metaphors and discursive constructions and all those sorts of things. But so what? Where are we going to use that? And that's the foundational question that inspires my work. How can we use rhetorical theory to better design health campaigns? And how can we look at health campaigns and understand the ideological underpinnings and what makes them work? Not just do they work, but why do they work? On a more immediate level, I'm inspired by things that I encounter in my everyday life. A couple of you, I saw Dinah out there in the audience, she saw me yesterday, talking about a campaign that I encountered in Singapore. I wasn't expecting to encounter a subway politeness campaign in Singapore. I didn't go in with a preset idea. But when I got to Singapore, I said, what are all these strange egg-shaped people doing telling me how to behave on a subway car? Doesn't everybody know that you should let other people onto the train first? You wait outside behind a little red line. Why are they doing this campaign? What undergirds that? Or another experience that comes from everyday life was when I was in Tanzania. I was just on sabbatical, which is great, right? Sabbaticals are awesome. I was in Tanzania, and I saw that in some towns, the communal toilet was hidden far behind the village, away from where it could be seen by anybody. And in others, it was brightly painted with all kinds of slogans on the roadways. The first thing that you encountered when you got to the town was the communal toilet. Why are they doing this? What happens here? I like to be surprised by everyday life. And it doesn't just happen in Singapore or Tanzania, it happens everywhere. It happens here in Philadelphia, it happens in your hometown, that there are all kinds of things where you say, they're trying to change my understanding of some healthy practice. They're trying to change the way that I go about my everyday life. How are they doing that? Why are they doing this? So one of the things that I advise all of my students, undergraduate or graduate students, is taken from the brilliant diagnostician Gregory House, MD. You need less books and more TV. You need to not just keep yourself in a dry, dusty library trying to find your ideas, but to go out and say, what surprises me when I encounter it out there in the field? And I'm constantly surprised by what I see in health campaigns and want to know, why are they doing this the way that they're doing it? What are the ideological formations that get activated? And then ultimately, how can we do it better? By studying it and seeing what they're doing, how can we do this better? In order to do this, there are two basic structures to answer all the rest of Lewis's questions that I engage in. When I'm doing a rhetorical analysis, I will begin, like many classic rhetorical critics, where I will say, here's my text, here's my campaign, here's my artifact, and I will analyze it closely, looking at it line by line, image by image, lyric by lyric, and try to understand exactly what's happening here. And based on looking at that text, it will tell me what theoretical frameworks to activate, what literatures to go into, because the text is the source of meaning when you go from a rhetorical approach. So you will often be surprised when on the surface you thought it was one thing. As you get deeper into it, you will see that there are metaphors or ideologies or ideographs or all kinds of other things that you hadn't anticipated from an initial level. This then gives you a theoretical explanation for why this works. What are they trying to do? What are the ways that it might impact the audience? Now, of course, my health communication friends would say, that's great, you analyzed the text, it's wonderful, so what? How do we use it? Which then leads to the next thing. I might come up with a potential theoretical explanation for how a particular campaign works. But if I want to improve communication practice, I will then say, I have this theoretical explanation. Let's go out and test it. Let's see if it works. And so, just like your traditional health communication person who engages in social scientific research, I will create 2 conditions, maybe more, to try to test them. One of the ones I'm doing right now has to do with an Australian campaign for obesity, where they show you jiggly belly fat to make you feel disgusted. And I know that that's what they're trying to do to activate that emotion. So I've created a series of messages that have the gross jiggly fat and that have a more neutral image that tell you to exercise more or eat right or whatever it might be. And then I expose 80 to 150 students to each one of the different conditions. I run a bunch of analyses using a bunch of statistical tests that if you had told me 15 years ago that we would be running structural equation models while doing rhetorical work, I would have been very surprised, but we use all that there is to use. You collect the data, you write it up, and of course the implications tell you what the new text might look like. This is a constantly recursive process because once I have the potential for a new text, if it gets generated, it then becomes subject to rhetorical critique because as an author of a text, I don't always know what I am saying. I don't always know what unintended messages I have encoded in my text. So we go through this cycle of the text, the analysis, the theoretical explanation, take the theoretical explanation, collect some data to test that, which allows you to come up with a new text, over and over and over again. It's a constantly productive research agenda. Now, on the practical level, how do I do this? I'm an old school debater. I take notes on paper. I have 3x5 cards where I take all of my potential explanations, all the citations I want to use, I shuffle them around. Yeah, I am ancient, yes. That is the process that I use. That's how I structure it. And then I can take my outline and just move things around if it's not working. It's great. Now you try to do this on a computer, you don't see what's on the next screen, you accidentally delete things, you have your EndNote file or whatnot, but the active act of putting things together in all of these different processes is what I like to do because it allows me to see new connections when I have, oh, I have this card over here, do I need this card? No, I don't need this card, or if it's over here, I'll do this. But it's all about being open. It's all about saying, you know, this card might fit. This card I might need to borrow from somebody else. I might need to do other things. And this gets to the last of Lewis's question. How do I communicate with colleagues about writing? I used to write alone. I don't write alone anymore. Almost everything I do now is with a colleague, whether it be a student, whether it be someone at my own institution, whether it be someone outside of the institution, because I have realized I am not as smart as I once thought I was. I don't know as much as I thought I did, and I certainly haven't read everything that I might need to read. So I'm constantly saying, I have this idea. Do you have ideas that you want to share on this? They say yes, sometimes. They more usually say, I have my own projects going on, but this other person would be really good. And so I build these connections with people who have substantive expertise or methodological expertise in the different issues that I'm engaging. And so to bring us back to Singapore, the reason that I discovered that campaign in the subway was that Mohan Dutta, who's at National University of Singapore, said, I want you to go see my students working on a project. And on our way to that project, we took the train, and I said, hey, have you seen these egg people? And they said, I've never seen these egg people, even though they've been up here for 6 months as advertisements. What's going on here? And by beginning that dialogue with somebody who had never been exposed to it, I was able to get new ideas. So it's always just about asking questions of other people and engaging in dialogue, whether it's somebody that reports to you, that you work with, or somebody that you don't even know. It's just being open to the process of exchange. So that's what I do. I think it's fun. I like it.
Juliet?
The first question about what inspires our work, I think, is a good place to touch base from. I started teaching at Rutgers in the early 1800s. I feel like I've been teaching for many years. Joking, but when I guess for my entire career, I've had one thing that has always caught my interest, and maybe from different angles, but I was always interested in the effects of the mass media on children, and especially I was interested in the effects of violent content on children. When I started teaching at Rutgers, I was looking very specifically at copycat violence. And this raises various questions, and maybe I should backtrack a little bit because I was so interested in media content and violence that for my dissertation, I actually went to Hollywood and I interviewed 75 television writers. And I had many, many questions that I asked them, and I recorded all the interviews and typed up the transcripts. But the overriding question, which I had to figure out how to ask very, very politely, was, why is television so bad? Right? And they actually had an answer that I didn't expect. Because let's face it, writers are really, really bright people. They're creative. And the answer that they gave me was, well, we, the writers, we are writing our hearts out, and we're trying to write something with good quality. But once our script, I don't know if you guys know this, but when a writer writes a script, once the writer gets paid, the writer no longer owns that script. It's totally different from Broadway if you write a play. If you write a play that's performed on Broadway, you own every word that you write, and nobody can change it. But television, once you write the script and you get your $50,000 for one script, that script is owned by the network. And the networks can make any changes they want. So what the writer said to me was, yeah, we're writing our hearts out to try to create quality, but the minute one guy said, the minute my script goes to the network executives say, punch it up, quote, unquote. Punch it up means add more sex, add more violence. And so this was always a concern of mine, even from the beginning of when I started doing research. And as I started looking more closely at copycat violence later, the thing that I kept seeing was that, sometimes, let's face it, a child sees something really horrible, a dangerous stunt, and imitates it and maybe dies. Or, sometimes there's copycat violence where members of a gang watch a gang violent movie and then they go out and shoot somebody in real life. And whenever the networks or the Hollywood movie producers are challenged, they always have the same response, which is, oh, well, we have a First Amendment, so we can make content as violent as we want to make it. There's absolutely, no constraints on how violent the content is. And so I started looking at this obviously from a First Amendment point of view. If I go forward in time to a little bit more recently, again, because I've always been concerned about media effects on children, I've been looking at issues such as cyberbullying. And the thing about cyberbullying, at least from the last 5 years or so, is that sometimes technology outpaces the ability of the law to keep up with it. And so if you go back 5 or 6 years, there were no laws in the United States that dealt with cyberbullying. Now state legislatures are trying to pass laws. So I've been looking at issues like that. And the question about what sources we use to help us in our research, I pretty much live by reading law review articles and court cases because my research is all First Amendment law. One thing that's really, really changed in a very nice way over the last 30 years, because I have been teaching for 30 years. When I started my research, the University of Delaware does not have a law library, so if I needed access to court cases or law review articles, I had to get in my car and drive to the Widener School of Law, and with my trusty Xerox card, which I bought from them, you know, I could Xerox court cases, and boy, did that take a long, long time. And there was a really, really nice reference librarian at Widener School of Law, and technically, because I wasn't a faculty member at Widener School of Law, I wasn't supposed to have access to Lexis and LexisNexis. This is before the University of Delaware got Lexis. And so she would kind of sneak me onto Lexis when nobody was looking. Boy, I owe her big time. And then eventually our reference librarian at the University of Delaware realized that yes, it probably was worth it to pay $100,000 a year, because that's what LexisNexis costs. And so, you know, the University of Delaware does subscribe to LexisNexis, and that was a sea change. You know, it made research so much easier to have access to that. In terms of the question about how we go about the process of writing, here I want to quote a colleague of mine. He was a journalism professor at the University of Delaware. His name was Dennis Jackson. He's retired now, but he would always say to his students, write it today, make it good tomorrow. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is so helpful for me, you know, and never mind about an undergraduate who's having trouble writing. And the other thing, I may be unusual in one sense, because I think most people who write a paper start with an idea and an outline, and then they follow their thesis or their outline and they write what they want to say. I'm not sure why, but for me it's exactly the opposite. Even when I wrote my senior thesis, because I was required to write a senior thesis as an undergraduate, I wrote 100 pages. Had absolutely no idea what my thesis was going to be. And after I wrote 100 pages and looked at what I'd written, it was kind of, oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. so you know, if you're a person who goes, it's kind of like going at it backwards, I guess. But if you go at writing backwards, where you just, it's kind of like you write down everything you want to say, and then I guess the best term I can use is it comes to you organically. It's an organic process where it's, I guess the best way to say it is it's not linear. For me, I just have to write. And then once I've been writing, and I promise you I'm not getting inspired, I'm not channeling other spirits, at least not that I know of. I think it's coming from me, but I know I have to write in order to figure out what to say. And if I could just for a moment go back to the very first question about what inspires my work, I want to tweak that a little bit and say who inspires my work. There are two people who are here at this conference, and everything I write actually is because of Susan Drucker and Gary Gumpert, because I see them at ECA and I see them at NCA, and every time I see them they say, hey, Juliet, would you write a book, how would you like to write a book about use of social media? And as long as I can add a First Amendment angle, freedom of speech, you know, it's like, yeah, I can do that, or I'd love to do that. And so they, over the years, Susan Drucker and Gary Gumpert have given me probably every single idea I've ever had in terms of what I wanted to write about. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks. Tom Corelli?
Okay, so Lewis titled this Muses, TV Shows, Libraries, and/or Brilliance. I'm going to have to go with Muses for 10. It's not about brilliance for me. And it used to be quite a bit about libraries, but I've got to say that I recently researched and wrote a book chapter where I did all of my research without leaving my laptop at my desk in my office. I just, plugged into the college's library databases and online journal provision and other e-resources, and I found everything I needed. Let me start, though, seriously, by briefly mentioning two of my mentors and how they influenced and imprinted my career as an academic. And I, too, am going to mention Gary Gumper, but in a different way. Gary was one of my mentors when I was an MA student back in the day in the Media Studies program at Queens College, City University of New York. And he said something to me during what was my first ever post-teaching observation meeting. It's just a passing, offhand remark that he made. But it stuck with me, and I always find it kind of funny, by the way, given all we talk about and all we write about in this business, what sticks with our students and what sticks with our colleagues. And we don't have control, but this stuck with me. Gary said, as an academic, I consider myself a creative thinker. Well, that's me too, first and foremost. And so there's the muses part, right? As a creative kind of guy, though, I have to acknowledge that I'm not always the most disciplined of people. But discipline is really necessary given the fact that, in this business we have multifaceted, compartmentalized descriptions of our jobs and our careers, right? Teaching, scholarship, and service is the obvious one, but, I'm a two-term department chair. I'm a past president of a couple of academic associations. I'm a teacher, advisor, mentor. I'm hopefully a valued member of my institution's faculty and community, etc., just like all of us in this room. But in the midst of all of those day-to-day responsibilities and all of the energies and efforts they require, we try to make time for what it is that we really want to do. Sure, I want to teach. I love teaching, and I love my students, one of them is here in the room. But sometimes, a lot of the time, I'll admit it, I just want to be left alone to write. Like the time that it took me to compose these remarks. I actually wrote my remarks, which I'll now get to my other role model. My other role model was Neil Postman, who taught us that the definition of what it means to be a writer is simply that you write every day as a force of habit. That other than the weekend and holiday and personal days you give yourself off, if you don't sit down and make the time to write for at least an hour, you're going to feel like something's wrong, that something is missing. You'll feel like you're not doing your job. And for the rest of the day, you're going to be out of sorts. Neil used to drive every morning from his home in Flushing, Queens, to a nearby bagel nosh. And he'd sit with his onion bialy, his coffee, a yellow legal pad, and a black felt tip pen. And he'd write for an hour. Then he'd get in his car and he'd commute to NYU to do the work that was required of him for the rest of his day. He wrote or co-wrote 25 books in exactly that way. Now I struggle, though, with the discipline of writing every day. I do my best writing in the morning with fresh energy and coffee, espresso coffee, lots of it. But I can't, like so many scholars who've told this tale. John Kenneth Galbraith is one who comes to mind. I can't get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and put in that hour or so when the house is quiet before the kids get up and breakfast has to be made and cleaned up and everybody has to get off to work and school. I can't even get up and go to the gym at that hour, right? Also, I guess I want to mention, there's a big difference between researching and writing a journal article or a book chapter and writing a book, which is something that I'm trying to do now on the very first sabbatical I've ever had in my career. 25 and a half years later. Benjamin was in Tanzania, and I'm here in Philadelphia on my sabbatical. I think it's important to know that, the journal article and the book chapter lend themselves to the structures and schedules of the life we live as academics. We can, do this kind of concentrated yet abbreviated work in the 1 or 2 research days that we get during a typical work week. A book, however, requires that you're in it for the long haul. Requires patience and pacing, stamina and endurance. It requires delaying and delayed gratification. And for those of us with significant others and children, it requires an incredibly understanding and tolerant family. One of the things I've also learned on this first sabbatical is that my home office is not necessarily the respite that I hoped it would be. Remember what I said earlier about wanting to be left alone? My wife is not an academic, but she works a similar kind of schedule. And, so now I'm there, right? I'm right downstairs. I'm not at the office. And in the meantime, and it just happened to work out this way, my oldest son is also a high school senior, and he has suddenly this truncated schedule where some days he goes in late, some days he comes home early. And then there are the other kinds of distractions at home that you're not faced with, that you don't think about, that you can't tend to when you're at the office. You know, those plants, they need watering, don't they? Oh, that faucet is still leaking. I've got to, call the plumber and set up the appointment, or if you're so inclined, I've got to fix it myself. But I have this alternative that's worked out beautifully for me. My local hometown library opens at 9:30 a.m. and it has a quiet room that I sometimes use for hours at a time. It looks out over the Hudson River and the Palisades. I once wrote an entire 73-page manuscript sitting in that room, and I'm now using it again. My wife can't knock on the door and say, hey, can you take a look at this for me? My son can't barge in and say, God, I need gas in my car. Can you lend me 20 bucks? The house plants can wither and die. Doesn't matter. As the final part of my remarks, let me talk a little bit about the muse. Let me talk about inspiration. One of the great things about being a student and a scholar of media is that, unlike our colleagues say in history or literature, I get inspired. My work arises out of things that are happening right now, things that are in process, in play, in flux. I'm constantly scanning the news and news about the media industry and paying attention to developments and updates. And then suddenly something just bites me on the part of my consciousness that I've trained to be open and on guard for such things. And I hit the ground running. Another great thing about this is that there's just endless and infinite possibilities then before me. Sure, some weeks, little happens or I miss things and so I'm uninspired. But then the next week comes along and brings a veritable avalanche of events and occurrences that I can concentrate on and work on and develop toward the next piece. If, of course, I can squeeze it into the midst of what I'm already doing. You never know when something will come along, but you can count on the fact that it will come and that these things will continue to come. And so then with respect to my scholarly preparation for this work, there's everything that I've ever read along the course of my career, and dating back to technically before I even had a career. But then each new idea also requires a literature of its own. Maybe better said, a new literature for me, a literature that I have not yet read. Thus, each new idea, a new piece propels me forward as a scholar. For instance, the book chapter that I was talking about before, I was asked to contribute to an anthology about transmedia journalism and transmedia practices. And I pretty much understood what the term transmedia meant when I was, when I got the invitation. So I agreed to write the chapter. But I had not really read the works of those scholars who define their perspective and their approach based upon this term. And so I had to go out, well, actually, as I said, I really just sat at my desk, and I had to read Marcia Kinder, and I had to read Henry Jenkins, and I had to read the work of a bunch of my colleagues from Central and South America. And lo and behold, I added another layer to my scholarship that wasn't there before. Anyway, I don't think I'm saying anything particularly novel or surprising. I don't reinvent the wheel with my particular scholarly process, but it is a process that speaks to, the scholarly process speaks to and brings into sharp relief our idiosyncratic nature. It's a function of our idiosyncrasies. And I think that reflecting on our own idiosyncrasies and on our process and coming to understand these things is a great and helpful exercise as long as it doesn't get in the way of carrying out the work. Sharing it, as Lewis has asked us to do here today, is also kind of helpful. Reassuring as we discover that we're all faced with similar issues and problems and stumbling blocks, those of our own creation and those brought about by the nature of the task at hand. And as we discover off, on our own and to ourselves in this quiet and personal pursuit, staring at black marks on a page or a computer screen, that we're really all in this together. I'll close with this thought. I worked for 3 years as a preceptor at New York University in their expository writing program when I was studying as a PhD student. And at the time, the overarching philosophy about teaching writing was that you really cannot do so. You can't teach someone to write. I can't, at this point, address all the reasons why you can't do so, but the point is, what you can do is talk to someone about their writing process and help them become aware of and honest with themselves about that process because it is with that understanding that we realize how our outcomes are wholly and only the byproduct of what we put ourselves through along the way. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Renee Hobbs.
Okay, hold on just a second. I'm gonna just play with my phone. Louis, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to talk about behind the scenes in terms of our scholarly and professional life. You and I have always appreciated media literacy as a way to pull back the curtain like the Great Wizard of Oz and see the man and the machine and the simplicity and the weirdness of it all. And it's actually really indicative of your own approach to scholarship that you would be so sensitive to process, reflecting that instinct of good teaching and of the journey of discovery that research really is. Today what I'd like to do is talk to you about following Louis's wonderful outline, which really, I think you can see how productive that outline has been for us. Following your outline, Louis, to make five points about my own sausage making experience, right? As a cook and as a creator. My first point about where the inspiration comes from is, for me, it comes from my activism. When I was about 30 years old, I woke up one morning and I thought, you know, it seems to me like every kid in the United States, all 75 million of them in elementary and secondary schools, should have some exposure to media literacy. Like, how hard is that? And that didn't seem very hard. I thought, okay, that might take 10 years or so. So let's work on that. Let's focus. Let's focus the energy on getting every kid in an elementary school or high school have one experience with media literacy before they graduate. That didn't seem so hard. But what that did was it forced me to be in deep partnerships. So what inspires me is kind of an impossible dream that has propelled me into a series of collaborative relationships, primarily with elementary and secondary school teachers, but also with other nonprofit and media organizations that are helping me to accomplish that goal. So right now I'm in a deep partnership with 2 school districts in Rhode Island, the Newport Public Schools and the Narragansett Public Schools, and I love the creativity of classroom teachers. It is absolutely amazing. You know, we have such a very different way of thinking about teaching because we might get 12 hours of contact time a week, right? Or 16 if you're really in trouble, right? But elementary and secondary teachers are in the room with children all day long. And their creativity, their improvisational strategies, their classroom management strategies, and their sheer endurance is super inspiring to me. So most of what I do is I observe teachers, I write about teachers, I try to capture their creativity as they try to figure out how to translate these abstract ideas about media literacy into activities that support student learning. I'm a big believer in this idea of balancing strong ties and weak ties in terms of cultivating relationships that help me accomplish my activist goals. So that means I try to be out there widely so that I can establish weak ties with a lot of people. But then I also try to cultivate strong ties that actually lead to partnerships, because those partnerships lead to writing. So weak ties allow me the reach to figure out who cares about this topic, and strong ties allow me to develop multi-year collaborative relationships. So for instance, one of the projects that I'm just now launching, the Mind Over Media project, which is a user-generated website for critically analyzing contemporary propaganda in all its forms. That project happened when I was at a conference that I sometimes go to. Somebody came up to me, handed me her business card, said, I'm working on Nazi propaganda for the Holocaust Museum. I was like, cool, right? Lo and behold, over a series of years, we found the media literacy connection, and then we recognized that it wasn't doing kids much of a service at all if the only time they learned about propaganda in high school was the stuff that happened in 1935 to 1940. That wasn't good enough. That if the only time we teach about propaganda is talking about 20th century Germany, we actually are doing our kids a disservice. We have to teach about propaganda in the 21st century in all its many forms. And that chance encounter led to a really robust partnership. And certainly this project will have its own life. Right now there's only one scholarly research article that I wrote on this, but over the next 3 years there'll be more. So my first point is about inspiration coming from the strong ties, the weak ties that turn into strong ties through partnerships. The second question you asked us to address, Louis, was this idea of where are our sources of, who and what are our sources? And like many of the panelists, I also get inspired by sort of chance experiences, and being open to chance is pretty important. I found myself with a group of 7th graders a couple years ago, and I was trying to figure out how to talk to them about transgressive media experience. That's really hard, because by definition, 12-year-olds do not want to talk to you about their transgressive media experience, right? They just, no 12-year-old girl or boy is going to say, oh yeah, I've typed in sex, or I've done things online I wouldn't want my parents to know about. They just don't, they're not going to talk about that in the classroom. So I did a little activity with Post-it notes where it was like, put down a YouTube video that you really like, and put down a YouTube video that like really freaks you out. And from that set of Post-it notes, a little trope kept coming up over and over, the scary maze game. And it was like, what is the scary maze game? So after that session was over, I went back, I discovered the scary maze game. It struck all kinds of chords with me, and ended up writing, doing a content analysis, looking at 100 scary maze game videos on YouTube that were produced in the United States, and 100 scary maze game videos that were produced in Germany, doing a cultural analysis of the differences in how children are represented as victims of a kind of violence, right? And intentionally scaring someone. So my sources include stuff like 7th graders telling me about their YouTube videos. I read a novel once, and I try to read to keep always a piece of fiction and a piece of nonfiction among my work, and stumbled across a guy named David Shields and his crazy, you can't call it a novel, really interesting, maybe a collage is a better term for this book, Reality Hunger. This book was so bizarre that I found myself thinking a lot about it, and ultimately ended up incorporating some of his ideas into my own work. So I think reading widely as well as reading deeply seems to work for me as a strategy. Right now I'm thinking a lot about creative destruction because I'm reading a book about Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was the guy, he was the coal guy, the railroad guy, the steamship guy, and thinking a lot about his approach to entrepreneurship, and thinking a lot about what in my field needs to be blown up so that new ideas can move forward. So I think reading widely, and especially reading fiction and nonfiction is really, outside of your discipline, is really important. So that's the second topic. Let me talk about the third issue. You asked us to talk about our work process. And because my work comes from my identity as a doer, my research process is tied to my outreach. So the data that I collect is always closely tied to the project. It's always organically emerging from the doing, right? So I try not to approach research projects as separate from projects. I think, let's go with the project. The project has a purpose and an audience and a goal, and then it throws off data, or I can along with the project, collect data alongside it. So for instance, for our Summer Institute in Digital Literacy, which is a professional development program for faculty, that project, its primary goal is as a professional development program for faculty, but it throws off a ton of data, right? And so I think that my identity as an activist and as a teacher educator and my identity as a researcher are kind of fused. So that makes life really easy. It's not like there's two parts of my brain. It's all the same process. But I want to say one more thing about the work process. This is really my fourth point. And again, I think it is appropriate to nod to Neil Postman here, and in terms of the constellation of talent assembled here, it seems kind of appropriate. When I spent the first 20 years of my life teaching undergraduates. And then I went and had to teach graduate students. And I was like, what is this all about? This is different. And I remember at some point along that journey having coffee or whatever, coffee or lunch or something with Neil Postman, and I was kvetching, grad students, And he told me about the magic of 7 sentences. And so I have used the 7-sentence magic with my grad students and with myself. Turns out that if you're trying to develop an argument, you should be able to develop the entire argument in 7 sentences in a triangle that goes like this, right? The broadest, biggest way in, that's the first sentence. And then you just keep drilling down until you get to your idea. It's that discovery process that you described, Juliet. So I try to outline my work with the magic of 7 sentences. And once I have the magic of 7 sentences, then I am a weekend warrior. That means I bang out a 4,000-word draft in a weekend, right? Because you can do it, right? Just Saturday and Sunday, boom, you're done. Now, and the reason why that's easy to do is because I have no standards. Okay? So if it's on paper, it's good enough as long as I get to 4,000 words. Now, once I have banged out that draft on a weekend, it's weird, but it's like it becomes my precious little baby. I have to take care of it, right? I have to make it better. I spend the first week after the weekend admiring it. Ooh, isn't it got beautiful eyes? Look at that lovely sentence there, right? And I just love it. Then I leave the baby in the closet for a while. Turns out that the baby calls to me. And when I reread it again a week later or 2 weeks later, I reread it and go, those eyebrows need a little, scoofing up, right? This shoulder scar is terrible. Let's patch this part that's weak, right? And I end up taking care of my baby, and pretty soon it becomes something I can show to somebody. And all of my writing is aided by my critical friends who help show me what's not working and who ask me great questions. And I couldn't imagine writing a page without those critical friends who because I don't have any objective stance on my baby, it's a personal thing you're writing, right? So that's basically my writing process. In terms of technology, I have benefited greatly from using Mendeley. If you're a graduate student in this room and you're not using Mendeley, I would suggest you get yourself right to that website. It's a social knowledge management tool. I use it to digitally annotate PDF documents that I pull off the databases, and I use it to do citation management, but it's really, really helpful for me as I build who are the key scholars that I'm going to be citing in a particular work. And since my memory is so fallible, I remember only the most recent thing I read or the very first thing I read, it helps me fill in the gaps. You know, the stuff I read 2 years ago, that, oh yeah, that actually would be perfect. So really a very helpful tool. Okay, so that's the magic of 7 sentences. Now the last point I want to make. This is this challenge. You identified it as how do you communicate with colleagues, but I'll reframe it a little bit. I'd like to talk about how you get work published. Who in the room is interested in getting work published? Yes, okay, so I have a secret that I'd like to share with you. Because once you learn this secret, it's just amazing how transformative it really is. I call it planes in for a landing. I want you to imagine the Philadelphia airport. Right now, at this very moment, maybe 100 planes are on their way in. Some are still in Chicago, right? Some are coming up from Baltimore. Some are right there in Wilmington, and some are almost on the tarmac. As a creative scholar, you have ideas that are at various places in the queue. Some are simply ideas that are just floating around. Then, next step, you become a weekend warrior, right? And poof, you've got a draft, right? Next, you get that to a conference, right? It becomes a conference paper. Now, for most scholars, that's it. For most scholars, once it gets to a conference paper, back up to the next idea. But no! If you adopt my strategy of planes in for a landing, the idea is let no good writing go unwasted, right? You need to take that conference paper and get it to a journal, right? And then when the reviews come back, you can't just throw those reviews in the garbage like some of us sometimes we do. We get so angry, right? You have to actually respond to that feedback, revise that draft, and move that thing through the process. Now, I admit, sometimes some of my planes have gone missing, right? One of those like Bermuda Triangle events where I don't know where that plane went, it just disappeared. But I maintain a Word doc. It's called Planes in for a Landing. Well, this year it's called Planes in for a Landing 2015. It has everything I have done, and it's organized by category, right? So this is still an idea. This is conference paper. This is out for journal review. This is revise and resubmit or reject, right? This is accepted for publication. This is published. And each 3 months or 4 months, I go back to that list and go, well, now, where are you on this, right? What needs to be pushed forward? What do I need to work hard on? Because it's true, time is a researcher's friend. A piece of writing that you wrote 2 years ago that you gave up on, that you thought was bullshit, right? When you revisit it, you're different now. You're different now. So going back to that manuscript allows you sometimes to see the weakness or the limitation or the gap and bring that thing down for a landing. So, in conclusion, why do we do research? We do research because we don't know what we're doing. That's why they call it research. I think one of the barriers to research productivity is we have attitude problems about it. We've learned today that research is a kind of learning. It's a very personal kind of learning. I think when we approach research with humility, when we recognize that it's just our way of documenting our learning, then we're a lot more humble about it, and we're a lot more accepting of other people's journey. Because perfectionism kills creativity. So by having a humble, learner-centered approach to research, we advance our own understanding, and that helps us advance the field.
Wonderful. So we've got time for questions, comments from the audience, our collaborators today. Without you, this would not be possible. So questions, comments?
I just have a comment. I now want to go write, which this entire semester I have not wanted to write a thing. Thank you, Tom. I'm the interim chair. But I now feel highly inspired, so I have all these ideas, and I actually really appreciate what you just said, because I'm now actually going to go and try that list. That was, it's not that I don't have that kind of sitting in my head and I've always tried to, as I always say, I always have things in the pipeline, because it was something I taught myself as I was, after graduation, those first couple of years that, the rejection after rejection after rejection, you just get to that point where you're like, all right, what the heck is all this for? And you just start feeling so, and then all of a sudden something happens, and then all of a sudden acceptance, 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 and so I had this massive stream of them after probably, I guess, after I was there 3 years, I don't know. And they all just kind of happened. There was like 2 a year. And so it worked out, but it was just things kept going into the pipeline. And I luckily do have a very supportive spouse who just kind of kept saying, just kept doing this to me. But I do think that I really like your idea about that it's having those ideas. Because what I have is like random pieces of paper on my desk. I was just staring at one the other day. I was like, oh, right, I started that paper. I have to go back to that, and I have things where stuff that's going to a conference and something that I've been working on for a while, but I think that's incredibly useful to still do. So I appreciate the idea of your playing metaphor, or to change my metaphor now.
I'm curious, sorry.
You're fine, go ahead.
For undergraduates and graduate students, what was interesting or intimidating and sort of, no, not me, or what was interesting? What did you take away from this? Let's start 1, 2, 3, and keep going.
What I find really interesting is that all of you guys touched on the fact that your idea sort of came either from like your everyday life and just kind of popped up from other people. Because as an undergraduate, I feel like sometimes I have to kind of figure out what I want to write about, and it's kind of nice to know that as I just kind of be in the world, I can find those ideas.
I really like the magic of 7 sentences idea. I've had to do things in 30 seconds, like explain your paper in 30 seconds, but not actually written out in 7 sentences. So I really like that concept.
I thought it was really interesting to see that you had such a wide variety of writing styles and processes, like everything from having very structured, like 7 sentences, to something that's more fluid. And I found it interesting that you obviously have all been published, so it's good to know that your style, there isn't one like this is the magic way to get published or to move forward with research. It really depends on the person, so just to see that you guys have all been so successful, and you have very different styles, so just encouraging to people like myself who might have a way that somewhere in between some of them, and so that was just good to see.
One thing that I noticed from everyone here is that a lot of your own inspirations are quite unique in your own interests. And going through my graduate program, a lot of what we were taught, not that we were taught otherwise to not follow your own thoughts, but was that if you're in that struggle of really wanting to learn good research and learn how to write good reports, you can kind of ride on coattails and do a secondary analysis, which I did in my first semester of graduate school. But then my own inspiration struck me one day, and I was watching Netflix, and I said, wow, Netflix is great. You can just sit here all day and just binge watch. It's fantastic. I really want someone to write about this. And I looked it up and I said there really wasn't much on the phenomenon of binge watching, so I went to my graduate advisor and I said, I want to do this. He said, all right, so we created a survey together, and I had 800 respondents, and I'm writing up my report right now. So it's just something that you really have an interest in. There's really no laws to it as far as what you can do. It's if someone's willing to help you get there, and obviously as a MA candidate, I'm not too fully versed in how to go at it, but luckily I have great faculty, Dr. B included, who has helped me along with that. So it's really interesting to know that you can really, what you want to do, you really can go out there and do it, which is great. You guys have touched on that, so thank you.
One thing that I was really amazed at, Ben, was your 3x5 note cards. And I have to tell you that is the way, my son is a crime writer. And he's a very successful crime writer. And that's the way he does it. He says there's no substitute for arcing out a exposition using note cards in terms of organizational, that there's no digital substitute for the seeing the arc and being able to move things around that way. And so while I can't actually imagine doing that myself, I'm like, okay, I wonder, the flexibility of that tool is obviously part of your creative process.
Yeah, it is. The one thing it does require, though, is space, and that your dog not come into the basement. but yeah, that physical layout really helps me. Now, it helps some of the folks that I work with to do that, but other people don't do that at all because they like the annotation idea where they can type into whatever search engine, okay, get me everything that I've read. That's what they love about Evernote. Everything that I've read about media effects, it organizes it for them. And so it is totally coming up with your own style. And one of the things that I learned back when I did this drawing class was to copy old masters and how they did theirs so that you could pick up the elements out of whatever they're writing, or whatever their drawing style was, so that you could create your own. And I think that's kind of what, if there's anything you can pull out of any of what the four of us or other people out there have talked about that helps you, you should totally pull that piece out and ignore what doesn't work for you. Like, find the thing that works for you. That's what I think we all say.
I thought the most interesting thing about the index cards was the media point when you referred to the fact that, well, you know, you do it on a computer screen and you can't lay that out. So it changes your habit of mind as a result. And, you know, gradually, I think I'm weaning myself more and more off paper in my life. I look at my office and I look at all of these books in my office, and we have our resident intellectual property thief at work, and he came in one day and he said, I've got 20,000 books for free for your iPad if you want them. And I'm like, okay, intellectual property issues aside, well, where are they? And he pulls out an 8 gig jump drive with 20,000 books on it, you know? And so, you know, as we move into that world, but again, how does that change your habit? How does it change your habit of mind reading the newspaper and flipping through all the pages versus reading it on a screen with the menu?
Could I add to that? Because when you were talking about the 3x5 cards, my first reaction was, yes. Because I definitely started out, maybe not with 3x5 cards, but with scratch paper, and then cutting pieces of scratch paper and taping them with scotch tape and moving it around. And so then after, I don't know, 25 years of working that way, my other thing was every article I read, I would print out a hard copy, and my husband started objecting to the cost of cartridges for ink. And so I forced myself very, very painfully to learn that I didn't have to print every law review article before I wrote from the law review article. But it's so different. And if you're using just your computer screen, very recently, I've learned that I can do sort of a copy and paste, and then you have to really be careful, because if I'm using what somebody else wrote, I want to immediately put quotation marks and citation, because otherwise you're literally plagiarizing. So I have to be super careful about that, using that copy and paste. But it does change the process in a really major way. I think you had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, I mean, it's comforting to know that writing is not easy. You all admit that it's a struggle, right? You have to make the conscious effort. You have to plan times of the day when it's best for you to write. Because I struggled a lot. I felt that it was like something that I was doing wrong, that I'm not so competent enough. But comforting to know that you all struggle through that as well. Thank you for sharing.
Okay. So a little background on this. I have two different research fields. I'm in documentary studies, but I'm also in fan studies. And so I don't know if any of you are in two different fields and how you might bridge those two. And so how you manage, I'm still a student, how you manage to do both of them effectively, I guess, and how you may split time or any suggestions of that.
Yeah, that's me. I am in 2 or more fields,
Yeah.
and I actually think it's probably good to focus. I advise my students are interested, students who come to me are interested in 2 fields too, but I think it's actually, you have to master one before you can get into the next one. So you can maintain a healthy reading interest across multidisciplines, but it's probably wise to, for the first 5 years, to master the discourse norms of one community before you go poaching into another, because each discourse community has norms and has ways of, ways of understanding the world. So think about playing the long game. In the long game, you'll be fully expert in both domains, but you can't eat the elephant all in one bite. So master one, then get the next one, and then they all come together. But you can maintain the healthy reading interest in both.
I think I'd also ask myself the question, are these really 2 different fields?
Oh.
Because if you're interested in documentary and you're interested in community fan culture, are there fan cultures or communities that come together around documentaries? And if so, maybe they really aren't different. I mean, I'm a rhetorician, I'm a health communication person, but they're both persuasion. And so I find that point of strategic intersect, and that's where you really need to do the deep dive into the literature, is at that intersect. And then whatever is on the margins, maybe that's what you say for later projects or later reading. That's good.
So I just had a question about something that you said and something that you said in terms of, you gave us this idea that, no matter what the idea, you should try and bring it in for the landing. And however valuable it might just be something that seems something you're interested in, but might not have a practical implication. You emphasized at the beginning of your discussion that you want to do something that's practical, that has some sort of impact on society or could be useful in some way. So what do you do with those ideas that you're passionate about, but you know aren't the most practical? It's just something that you have a desire to learn more about or discuss. How would you figure out what you should do with that idea? That was just kind of my question.
I prefer things that have a practical impact. That doesn't mean some of what I do is not completely frivolous. If you ever have some time and you want something really weird, one article that I wrote in Rhetoric Review, I think, with Chris Stroop, was called The Eternal Sunshine of the Solar Anus. And it is a postmodern textual play that also analyzes the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, the Jim Carrey movie, where he actually did something serious. And it has no practical impact whatsoever, but that's because I was working with Chris, and to help Chris in his approach to the academy, he wanted to be a post-structural rhetorician. I bracketed my interest in favor of his interest in that particular project. And so almost everything I do is written with someone else, and it's a matter of negotiating which attitudinal preference is going to dominate this particular paper. And so in that case, we bracketed the practicality in favor of play. And it's a completely useless paper, completely useless as far as society is concerned, but it was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, and I think the way you should approach the idea is when you're learning to be a researcher, it's your learning is the goal, right? So I don't know that it'd be a really tough bar if we had every paper or every project we have has to have some significance in the world. It's actually a learning process. So if you learned, then that was a good paper to write, right? That's what research is.
Not to get too deep into the philosophical weeds, but how do we end up judging what's significant and what's not? Because, yeah, that might be a fun process, but that's also a really good exercise in critical thinking, and for somebody who's reading that, it may provide a different way of being able to look at things which has significance. And I think that it not only improves that person, but it improves society as a whole. So, I mean, yeah, does it have, what gets me about that, I think it's touched this kind of nerve now where academia is under attack from all of these people that have no clue as to what academia is about, but is looking at, does it have some sort of practical significance? So.
The 7 sentences exercise speaks to significance, right? When you get to the top of the triangle, the bigger picture, I'm interested in violence and media, right? Okay, well, what about it as we work our way down? I think one of the things that you're taught when you're taught that 7 sentences exercise is to say, what is the significance of what I'm doing? I'm not carrying this out as some sterile intellectual exercise or something that's going to get me my degree or going to get me tenure. But you put the two words together. Significance does not mean practical significance. It was Stanley Fish, I read him recently, talking about how one of the problems that people outside of academia have with academia is they don't realize that just talking about something without an end game, without an outcome, is an important, significant exercise in itself.
I'm reflecting on the phenomenon in our field that we have multiplicity of journals. They just keep getting, we get journals keep multiplying like weeds, right? It's easier to publish now than it ever was because there are more journals to publish in. And this issue of significance is something that we face as we address the tenure, promotion, review process, right? How does a knowledge community determine what constitutes new knowledge? So there's a real tension between this idea that research is a journey of learning, and yet this field building idea that research is actually a way to advance knowledge in the field. And I think partly what's happening in the field of communication right now is that we've got some tension there, right? And we may address it overtly or we may not, but it's part of what creates some of the fractures and the sort of hyper-specialization that's happening in the field now. And it's partly why young scholars struggle with that hyper-specialization, encouraging them to go very, very narrow, when all of us are intellectually curious people with wide-ranging interests, and we don't necessarily fit in just one box.
I love touching nerves. The way that I talk about what is meaningful to me doesn't have to be the same that's meaningful to you. And this is something that, taking on a different hat, when I was editing CQ, Communication Quarterly, my definition of significance did not control what emerged as important. My job as an editor was to select the people that I thought would be the best readers for a particular manuscript. And they would be the ones who say, this has philosophical significance, this has practical significance, this has whatever kind of significance they thought was emergent or not emergent from that particular exercise. And as an editor, I can't tell, I'm a gatekeeper, right? But I shouldn't narrow the gates to only what I wish to have. I have to be open, and that's why I work with someone like Chris when he wanted to do the philosophic exercise for its philosophic import. It's not my preference, but hey, I'm only one person. I'm not the field, and I think we have to be open to other perspectives and ideas.